Let's bring in James Dorn, Vice President for Academic Affairs at the Cato Institute, and he does join us live from Washington, D.C. Good to have you with us, James. If I can ask you, do you think Geithner's trip to China has made a difference between US-China relations?
I think it was a very successful trip in terms of getting closer relations, but it's just the first meeting. And the serious U.S. problems that China is worried about, worrying out loud for the first time about the huge U.S. debt and the future of the dollar, will mean that we have to have substantial discussion about the future of the international monetary system and the U.S. fiscal problems.
Yes, in the backdrop of all that, we've had a falling US dollar this week, despite Geithner trying to soothe over concerns and saying that the Chinese investment is very safe. Do we need to see some sort of improvement to attack those deficits in government spending, but also some improvement in the US dollar?
Well, the Federal Reserve has expanded its balance sheet substantially in the last year and a half, and then we have about $10 trillion worth of new debt that's going to be issued in the next decade. And this year's deficit and next year's deficit are going to be record-setting. And that's what the Chinese are primarily worried about. We can make promises that will safeguard their investments in the U.S. debt, but our actions speak louder than our words, and our actions are such that people are losing confidence in the U.S. dollar. And unless the Obama administration substantially reduces not just the deficit, but the size of the U.S. government, both its size and scope, the Chinese and others will not put much credibility in the future of the U.S. dollar.
James, this is Martin Soong. Let me jump in. A small change, I think, is flagging much more significant changes in the relationship, and that is the small change, of course, is it's not the SED anymore. It's the strategic and economic dialogue. I mean, right now, of course, it's about the economy, but it's also about cyber terrorism and warfare. It's also about containing China's influence within Asia and offsetting any loss of influence that the U.S. may be feeling. What is on the cards? What does Obama want to do you think?
Well, it's very interesting because we're on the eve of the anniversary of Tiananmen, the 20th anniversary, and not a word has been said about human rights issues, either by Secretary Geithner, by the other people in the Obama administration, including Hillary Clinton, and Nancy Pelosi's been very silent. These are issues that are going to affect the long-term prosperity and freedom of China and its people. And they will have to be brought up at any kind of strategic dialogue. So it's not just the economic liberalization that we're interested in. We're also interested in having China develop a civil society and a more limited government so that the power of the government shrinks relative to the private sector. Hong Kong's example is small government, big market, and that is kind of the path that China should be taking in the long run.
And would you agree that the silence on the human rights front speaks to just how severe this crisis is and how important, or how much more important, economics has become? Because you would expect just about any other Democratic administration to start harping on things like human rights, especially ahead of this anniversary.
Oh, there's no question about it. The Schumer and Graham were proposing just a short time ago to put prohibitive tariffs on China unless they revalued their currency. Nobody's talking much about revaluing the Chinese currency now. We're talking about fundamental reform, but nobody said exactly what that means. Zhou Xiaochuan said a couple weeks ago or a month ago that he wanted fundamental reform in the international financial system and to downgrade the U.S. dollar somewhat. That's strong language, and that'll be thoroughly discussed at the Strategic and Economic Dialogue in July.
James, the fact that China hasn't received any more pressure on the yuan in these talks, does that signal a fundamental shift in power that we're now seeing? Because the US really does need China's support to fund its level of debt, but also to assist it with North Korea in taming some of the forces at play there.
Well, that's right. China is our biggest creditor, and that's why the U.S. has been relatively silent. We also need China with respect to the North Korean situation and terrorism around the globe. So what Geithner made clear was that China was going to be elevated in the international system. And it's not because we necessarily all want to elevate China in the U.S. Congress, let's say. but rather China has the upper hand in this. They're the third, soon to be the second largest trading nation in the world. Their economy will be the world's largest economy in another 20 years or so, probably. The renminbi is becoming a much more important currency, especially in Hong Kong. So China's on the ascendancy. The U.S., on the other hand, China's talking about socialism with American characteristics, and they're puzzled over that. U.S. was always the beacon for a liberal society. We've moved away from that. So I think we need to make it loud and clear that the U.S. is going to return to a liberal system and protect individual and economic freedom around the world, especially starting right in the United States, and we should set the example. We haven't been setting the example. We're bailing out GM, we're growing the government, and one unintended consequence of China's currency undervaluation and the fact that they're buying so much U.S. debt is they've allowed our government to grow a lot faster than it otherwise could. And that is an unintended consequence. So if China lets its currency float upward, it's not going to accumulate as much debt from the U.S. The U.S. will then have to increase its savings rate, and China will have to do just the opposite. Those will be natural changes.
There, James. If I can just jump in and ask you what other implications you could expect to see if China does have a more elevated perch on the world stage. Will there be a greater shift in other economic policies and also diplomatic affairs?
I think China will internationalize the renminbi over the next decade. They're going to open up their capital markets more, which will be a very good thing to have capital freedom. The exchange rate will have more flexibility as a result. These will be changes that will be thrust upon China, and if China is also more liberal economically, that portends well for the society as a whole, because the rising middle class in China does have more economic freedom and more personal freedom than it did 20 years ago. So we certainly don't want to revert to destructive protectionism. That's essential that we don't do that. And China will take a much more active role, I think, in the foreign affairs as well. They don't want a lot of North Koreans coming into China. They don't want a nuclear North Korea that's disruptive, that can lead to a chaotic situation. So there's a lot of things that we can agree on and a lot of things that we can move forward on, and I think that's what Geithner wants to do.
James, very quickly, seconds away before you go, would it be fair to say that 20 years after Tiananmen, while China is a heck of a lot richer and has lifted millions of people out of poverty, you know, it is still as scary as it was then in terms of human rights, lack of press freedom, etc.?
Well, there's no independent media, there's no independent judiciary, there's no rule of law, and there's no definitive boundary between the individual and the state that protects individuals' rights to life, liberty, and property. So China has a long way to go, and we shouldn't let China forget that, nor should we forget it. And we have to set the example in protecting our own rights in the United States and moving again towards a more liberal system compared to what we have right now.
Okay.